Hi, everyone. I'm going to be doing a talk about Jenkins pipelines, agents, and some more. Hi, I'm Eldad. I'm a DevOps architect for JFrog. I've been doing 20 years of software development and mostly in the infrastructure world. And I've been literally doing CI/CD since it was done with stick and stones. And Jenkins did save my life. And in this presentation, I expect you to be a Jenkins newbie, wanting to learn more about Jenkins. You should know what Jenkins is, have a bit of experience with it, at least clicked up a couple of builds. Hopefully you know how to create a simple freestyle job and want to deepen your knowledge. Familiarity with Docker is nice to have. It is really not important for this. I'm going to be talking about Jenkins pipelines. I'm going to be talking about BlueOcean. And later, we're going to go into Jenkins Agents, also known as slaves. I am not going to deep dive into any of these topics. The idea is to get you familiar with them, give you a good quick start, and get you the initial information you need in order to go back home and develop some cool CIs and CDs with pipelines. Most of the examples are based on a GitHub repository I've set up, which is also freely available, and you can later on go to it and see some of the examples, extend them, and play around with them. And contributions are always very welcome. And as Moore said in the talk before me, go read the documentation. There is real good documentation by Jenkins themselves that will give you pretty much an answer to all of your questions. So if you really want to go and deep dive into the information and get yourself up and running quickly and reliably, do read the documentation before going and just copying bits of code from different parts of the internet. Okay, so I'm going to be going through the slides, talking a bit about the ideas behind these topics, and then at the second half of this talk, I'll be doing some demonstrations. And of course, you're always welcome to ask questions at the end of this talk, and afterwards I am available. You are more than welcome to come and meet me, ask me any question, even not related to Jenkins or pipelines or agents, and I'll be more than happy to help. All right, so where are we coming from? We want to take your already great CI workflows and we want to make them better. And everyone's familiar with this notion of having bits of good code connected between them, and we want to take it one step further. Have a completely streamlined CI. Everything is fully automated. Everything is hands-free, comes in and comes out. You get feedback all along this workflow, and you can go and get a cup of coffee while your CI is delivering the latest version of your product to production. So why do we need pipelines? Where did this come from? The need came from a demand in the community. Shlomi said before that everything here is driven by the community. And the community has picked up its speed to velocities which require you to be very fast, very agile. And you need to release fast all the time. And to be able to do that, you have to have strong workflows which are reliable, fully automated, and are hands-free. The DevOps culture that rose in the last several years has been all about linking the development with the operations and streamlining it into a single pipeline where you can see everything, you can link everything, you can use everything with a single point of view. The old freestyle jobs are harder to maintain, especially when your workflows and your pipelines become more complex, and the need becomes more and more apparent to be able to meet the demands of the requirements coming from the product itself. So delivering a small jar file is different than delivering a whole system. Pipelines are written as a single script. It has a distinct DSL. We'll see examples. There are two syntaxes. As of the pipeline version 2.5, there's a new declarative syntax. I'll show you examples later on, but the more familiar one is the scripted one. The declarative takes one step further in simplifying and allowing you to define everything you need as part of a single script, including your job's configuration, your job's parameter, the pre-build, the post-build, and everything in a single script. You'll see the examples as we move forward. There's the pipeline type Jenkins job. With the move to Jenkins 2, that the pipeline is a core part of it, there is full compatibility with the older versions. And a lot of organizations going through the phase of moving from the old Jenkins to the new still need to be fully compatible with the old and have the functionality of the new. And I've been approached by many people here and outside of the conference talking about how to migrate your old jobs into pipelines. So Jenkins currently is in kind of a transition where it supports the old but is advocating the new. And here we are talking about the new. The pipeline type job is actually describing your whole CI and CD as code. And it is related very tightly to the whole concept of have everything managed and tracked in a single place with a single source of truth, which is always accessible, is manageable, is trackable, is auditable, and is easy to manage and see. The Jenkins file, which we'll see later, is a descriptor, is a file that actually holds that code. It is usually put in your repository, more often in the root of your repository, and once you load that into Jenkins, it will pick up and see it and use that Jenkins file. We'll see that. And also, with the growing development in branches, we also want to easily provide the CI to be run on every individual branch with no effort at all. And the Jenkins pipeline, or the Jenkins multi-branch pipeline job type, allows us to do that. And you'll see that in a few minutes. BlueOcean. You've heard Koska talk about the BlueOcean before. BlueOcean is rethinking the Jenkins user experience, and Jenkins has been looking pretty much the same for the last decade, with a few changes. And there came a need to simplify the way that we see things, both for our daily use and both for people just wanting to see the status, the workflows, and where do we stand with the pipelines. The BlueOcean is designed for pipelines and is technically compatible with old type jobs, but is mostly comfortable with pipelines. We'll see that. It is currently come as a plugin, but you can already find official versions of the Jenkins installer with BlueOcean pre-installed in it. And of course, there's documentation for that. So the user experience is transitioned from the old to the new. A single pipeline which used to look, or a single job which used to look like this, now looks like this. Easier to see, easier to understand. If you're able to see, you can see that the parallel build step is now better displayed and better showed, and easier to understand. I'm going to talk about Jenkins Agents now. because they're going to go and be a part of the demo as we move along. I'll be showing you different examples of the pipelines with agents, without agents. So I want to talk about agents now, so we'll all be linked together during the demos. So Jenkins Agents, also known as slaves in the past, are a way to offload the work from your master. Initially, you just did everything on your master. You need to have a strong Jenkins master that was configured to be able to run an RPM build, do your Maven builds, do all your tests, and everything was in a single server. So that server had to be pre-configured to be able to do everything. With the use of agents, you can do a separation of concerns. You can keep the master or the Jenkins just to run Jenkins itself. It has no need to be a very strong server. And the agent nodes are best configured for their intended tasks. So you can have a Windows agent, you can have a Linux agent, you can have different flavors of Java agents, and each one for their intended role. So for example, you can build an RPM on one agent and then build a Windows MSI on another agent. You can parallelly execute your job or your tasks within a job on different agents to save time and to better use the resources of your setup. So it will look something like this. You'll have a local network hosting the Jenkins master. Everyone going to the Jenkins UI will be linked to the Jenkins master. The Jenkins master will be pre-configured to have different slaves, different agents all over, either within the network itself or outside the network, in a public cloud or in a private cloud, anywhere that Jenkins master can connect to can literally host an agent. And this can pretty much delegate all of your work to anywhere in the world, whether geographically or conceptually. If I need to do some sort of a build, test, and deployment on Azure, I'd rather have the Jenkins master in my network, but the agent in the Azure cloud. And the same for my local build. If I just need to build some RPM to later distribute, I can have a Jenkins agent hosting CentOS or Red Hat locally in my network to build that RPM and then use it later on for either distributing it to my customers or for internal use. There are different agent connection methods. In Moore's presentation, the previous presentation, there were some questions about how do you connect to slaves. I'll show you that. But the idea is that you can harness any server that is running or supports Java to be as your agent, even other types which are not exactly Java-based, like Docker containers, that you can delegate your work to them, have them do their work, and then tear down. Dynamic agents. I've been frequently asked about dynamic agents. One of the nice features that Jenkins provides is the ability to dynamically provision an agent on demand. Instead of pre-configuring 100 agents spread all over the network, costing me money and costing me time to set up, I can configure my Jenkins beforehand to allow spinning up of dynamic agents. This can be done with a variety of plugins, and this presentation will eventually be made available, so you can also reference and see the list of plugins and try them out yourselves. The plugins are fairly well documented. Moore in his presentation showed an example of the EC2 plugin, which spins up an agent in AWS, allows you to delegate your work there, and then tear it down once it's done. It is based on using an AMI that was pre-built and is hosted in your AWS account. And the 6 examples I show here are just some of other options that can be used to be able to provision agents dynamically. I will show some examples to some extent. Again, I'm not going to go and deep dive too much because I'd rather show you the variety of options that you have and give you the initial seed to go on and further deepen your knowledge later with the documentation. List of references, which means that we're pretty much at the end of the slides. We're going to start going into demos. Okay, so let me zoom in a bit. Can you see this well? Okay. I hope this is better. Sorry? Focus, it's not in my control. This is a screen. Okay, we'll try and manage. So this is pretty much our old and well-known Jenkins interface with the jobs. I'm going to set up a new pipeline. This is Jenkins 2 in this case. I'm going to set up a very simple pipeline just to explain. Oh, wait, before that, I wanted to mention, I said before that the examples here are based on a GitHub repository I've set up. And this repository, that can also be found later on, has also instructions of how I set up this demo. I've used Vagrant to run my Jenkins master and a couple of Jenkins agents, which can be used to understand and demonstrate most of the examples in this talk. As I said, you're more than welcome to look into it and offer some of your contributions to it. All right, so I'm going to be setting up a new Jenkins pipeline. I'm going to leave everything. I'm going to scroll down to the pipeline part. If you really want to quickly get started, sample hello world. It'll just dump the script to this text box. And you can see this is the editor, the DSL syntax is presented here. As I've mentioned, you have a lot of examples in the documentation, but I'm going to show you more examples as we move along. I save this, I build it, and it works. Now this does not define any stages, so it recommends that I go on and define a stage, sorry. So I'm going to do another pipeline. This time I'm going to try another sample. And this sample just pulls out a Git repository. You can see it has more elaborated steps. It divides the pipeline into different stages. And it's going to build a Maven build for me. I'm going to build it now. And you can see it also shows a block for every part of the build. Each block represents a stage. If I go in to see the console output, it's something that is very similar and should be familiar to all, with some additional outputs that were put to the console by the plugin, by the pipeline plugin itself. So once it's done, there were some unstable tests. You get the result, and you get the build, you get the jar file that was published and archived, and everything was literally spun up in less than 20 seconds. And this is the initial idea behind the Jenkins pipelines. I want to show you some more examples now, which are based on the repository that I've created. As I mentioned before, I've set up a couple of agents, Agent 1 and Agent 2, My whole setup is based on Docker. I have Jenkins master running as a Docker, and the 2 agents also running as 2 Docker containers. So these are 3 Docker containers running inside my Vagrant. All right, I want to show you. Can you see this? Is it okay? All right. So, for example, showing you an example of how you run your build with 3 different stages, each stage built on a different agent. So when I go out and build it, I can see if this one is running on master, this one is running on agent 1, and this one running on agent 2. Okay, this way, by using the fairly simple syntax, I've delegated the stage to run on a pre-configured agent. Another requirement that we often see is the need to parallel the execution. So in this example, what I've done, I have built a pipeline that has an initial stage that does the initialization, the preparation, whatever you'd like to do, and then runs a parallel step where I define a parallel block, and then I defined 3 different parallel steps. The name thread 1 is just something that I've chosen. It doesn't have to be configured like that. But again, it shows the combination of a parallel task along with executing the task on a pre-designated agent. So this way, I also delegate to different agents, and I also parallelize the work. Go into Jenkins, simple parallel. Before I continue, yes?
Can I do a parallel job on the same machine?
Yes.
And can I be sure that the pipeline will not continue unless all the threads have finished their execution?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. Can I execute parallel tasks together on the same agent? The answer is yes. And can I make sure that the execution does not continue once one of the parallel tasks is finished? Then yes, it will not continue until all 3 threads, all 3 predefined parallel stages have been completed. So you can reliably know that it will get to the 3rd stage in this case, only when the 2nd stage, which are the 3 parallel builds, is completed.
One more, please. Are you going to show how to work with artifacts, how to copy from one stage to another? For example, if thread 1 is supposed to give me some artifacts which I need in the 2nd step, how can I do that in scripting?
It's not in the scope of this, but I can talk to you about this maybe later on if we'll have more time.
I will appreciate that. Well,
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I just want to execute this so you'll see how it looks. Okay, so you can see the output is also parallelized, and it's a bit confusing at first glance, but you need to be very forgiving. I think that the verbosity of the logging in the pipeline is somewhat annoying, but once you get used to it, you'll see that it's actually a good log where you can get all the information because it explains to you what's the context of the pipeline, and especially in the parallel parts, the context of the thread or the task that's being run. And it shows you the information of where it's running and what agent and in what location as far as the file system is concerned. In this case, I've also echoed the date and time, just so you'll see that they are executed in parallel while sleeping. So 14:38 and 10 seconds on all three agents at the same time, and then they're all sleeping. And I've also touched a few files, so I can show you one of the repeating questions I've been asked is, where's my workspace? In the old job types, it was very easy to have a link to the workspace, whereas here, there is no workspace. And many times, we like to see a file on the workspace where the job was executed, to see its content, to maybe pull it, or maybe understand an internal log which is not displayed as part of your output. So in this case, you need to go into the build, select the pipeline steps, go to the node allocation link, and then you get the workspace. I know it's not very friendly, but just so you'll know it's there, okay?
Does it mean that all the agents share the same workspace?
Not necessarily, because in this case I have 3 agents, the master and 2 agents, each with their own file system, since they're all Docker images. Sorry, I was looking at the... Sorry. I was about to say that they each have their own workspace as part of their build context, okay? Moving on, next example. You've heard me before mention the different syntaxes. So the pipelines are now moving towards a more declarative approach of the pipeline. To those of you who already know pipelines, it might be something new, less popular. It's just now starting to get into more popular use, and personally I recommend it because it is a more obstructive approach to have predefined tasks and stages which allow you to very easily build your workflow and pipeline. So one major difference is that it is defined within a pipeline block rather than a node block, if you remember before. And inside it, you can declare many parts of the job which were traditionally defined outside as part of the job configuration. So you can configure the parameters, you configure the tools, you can configure the post-build actions that you like, and everything within your Jenkins file, rather than have it as part of your job configuration and partly within the Jenkins file DSL. So in this example, I am defining a tool, which is a Maven tool called M3. In the options, I'm telling it to discard builds and keep only the last 10 builds. Timeout. After 30 minutes, we'll kill a hung job. And then comes the stages, which are the equivalent of our main build steps. So I clone the sources, I do a Maven build, I do the JUnit report, and then I archive the war. And at the end, I'd like to notify. Do some post actions, like I always want to clean up after myself. And if I succeed, I like to say a good job mail, or if I fail, send mail and notify of the job failure. Going back to the documentation, there is a fairly good explanation of the syntax. One of the links here. Here we go. And you can see the declarative pipeline, which all of the different sections that it supports. Very informative, very useful. Please read it. It is a good starting point because it has good small examples that you can start with and then extend and make your jobs more complex. And there's also a reference further down for the old scripted syntax. Okay.
So
Yes.
you said that
Okay.
My question is, what is the level of support of the pipeline plugins with regards to API to other plugins, like, I don't know, the email notifications, and, we have a bunch of stuff we're using, like the factory plugin and stuff like that.
All right, so it's a good question. The pipeline was designed in order to be able to integrate as much as possible with existing plugins and environment. A lot of other plugin developers have developed the support for the plugin. So, for example, you've mentioned the Artifactory plugin. So the Artifactory plugin team has developed the integration with a pipeline. So you have tasks that you can define within the DSL that help you work with Artifactory. So you don't need to configure it as part of the original build configuration, but again, it can be as part of your pipeline DSL. You can see examples for it in the documentation pages.
But we can't assume that whatever works for the job DSL plugin will work with the pipeline plugin.
No, you can never assume that. I suggest you always test that.
No, I mean, when we come to plan our next solution. Thanks. I'm saying when we want, let's say, to migrate some of our stuff from the job DSL plugin to the pipeline plugin, when we plan it, we need to understand that we might have some limitations because probably a lot of the plugins that are used in the job, that support the job DSL plugin are not yet supported in the pipeline plugin. Right.
Well, again, it comes to your responsibility to check and test it because you cannot rely that everything was migrated and it was made compatible. It is always up to versions, and again, you're up to the community. And many of the plugins are developed by the community, so either the community is not up to speed with the development of Jenkins and the pipeline itself, but I always call for testing. We've done some major migrations from old freestyle jobs to Jenkins pipelines, and we found a lot of incompatibilities initially. Some of them were fixed along the way, some of them still exist, and at the end of the day, you can always use the pipeline to just call bash scripts, and it'll work just as it did before, just that now your Jenkins files is part of your sources, it's better managed and easier to track.
Thanks.
Yes. Can you microphone?
In the same venue, when you're talking about job DSL plugin, it's like meta job generator. You can, with one job that generates a lot of other jobs, update, I don't know, your job pipelines, workflows for different contexts, be it branches or sites or teams of products. If they share the same logic with some differences with this job DSL plugin, you can generate and update them on the fly very easily. Here also Kashuki showed us that we can use, for example, library, Groovy library for using the code, but we still need to manually maintain top-level job for every context.
Eventually, yes, you do. Every one of your pipelines has to be defined, has to be managed. And the migration from your old infrastructure or your old methodologies and pipelines to the new ones, it could be cumbersome because you do need the way to translate your old special custom built-in solutions to the new Jenkins way of things or the new pipelines way of things. And some of these migrations are hard and even painful because you've been sustaining or supporting the same complex configuration for many years. No one really wants to touch it. And now comes the time when you really have to touch it. And you're opening this Pandora box and finding that it has a bottomless end to it. But yeah, it is a process that has to be carefully tailored and carefully tested. But I think it's worth the effort. I've seen this done in several locations at JFrog and even before. And the reward you get for doing that migration is great. Because just the fact that it's now everything is centralized in one configuration file or one DSL that describes your whole pipeline and is trackable, manageable, is, I think, amazing.
Another pane we have seen is visualization with a complex workflow or pipeline where we have nested parallel steps. Previously, we achieved it by build flow and build graph, a couple of plugins. And we've seen the boxes with a lot of context information connected into the graph, directed graph that correspond to the execution order and parallelization. With BlueOcean, I mean, we cannot visualize nested parallelization. Do you know whether the visual tools come along with development in pipeline syntax and infrastructure as well?
Right. Well, here again, it's something that's up to your organization to resolve end of the day. I'm going to be showing BlueOcean in a few minutes. And yes, some of the things are hard to visualize in BlueOcean, but BlueOcean comes to solve a few other issues and actually simplify the way things are displayed. So I'd like to move on to the next example. Show you how it runs. We've talked about the declarative. So I'm going to build this now. This is a longer pipeline. And again, it runs, was pretty quick. You can see the post-build actions, the always clean, and a good build, send mail. There wasn't a failure, so we're good here. Moving on to our next example. This is something that I like because it has, I'm also using the declarative syntax here, because here I also introduce parameters. If you remember, we defined the parameters as part of your job. In this case, we define the parameters as part of our pipeline. And then we can use these parameters to apply build logic into our pipeline. So I define a custom text, a debug build checkbox, and a release checkbox. And later on, I can execute code depending on the state of these checkboxes. In our example, the Maven build will either do a Maven -X for debug output if I select the debug build checkbox. And at the end, we'll release if I select the release checkbox, sorry. So I build with parameters. These are the parameters that were defined in the Jenkins file. So I'm going to leave the debug, and I'm also going to select, put my text here, and build. So here's my text. Debug build is set to true, so you can see the output of a Maven with its debug output, sorry. And at the end, since I checked my release, I also do the release. These conditionals can also be set on different property types, like the branch type, the result of a previous step. So take, for example, a CI or a CI/CD where at the end you'd like to deploy the output to a system, staging or even production, but you'd like that to be done only from the production branch. So you can find examples of how you set the when depending on a branch. If I'm not mistaken, it's just when branch and then wrap it with the name of the branch. Something as simple as that. You can find more examples for that in the documentation. Let's talk about agents. All right. So this is an example of a simple pipeline where I'm actually running my build on a dynamically spun up Docker slave, in this case Docker agent, sorry, which is based on the Maven JDK 8 image. The Docker node, which is mentioned here, is based on one of the plugins that I've mentioned before. It's the Docker slave plugin. Now, it can be configured to run on the same Docker host that you're running, but it can also be configured to use a remote Docker host. So you can have it spin up the actual build on a remote host that you have access to it, okay? So this is just for reference. I'll show you how it looks. All right, so you can see that a new agent has been spun up. It's a container for this job. It's taking it a bit to spin up and pull the sources. I'm pulling out the sources from an example. In the previous lecture, there was a question of how do I dynamically provision agents without the need to actually go to the agent. So this is one of the examples where you delegate the work to your Jenkins master. You tell it, you go ahead using that plugin, spin up the agent that you need, do the work with it, and then tear it down. So since this is a fresh new container, it needs to pull all of its dependencies every time it builds. You get a completely fresh and clean build, but the best part of it, it's a dynamic slave. So you can define it to use any Docker image that you'd like. So different Docker images for different needs. If you remember, I can have a CentOS Docker image to build my RPM. I can have a Debian one to build my Deb, and use the specific Docker container that matches my need. Let's see if I can catch it running. So you can see this is my Docker container running my Maven build. Okay? These three containers are the containers for my Jenkins master and 2 agents. Just to note, my Jenkins master is actually a local image that I have built. It has a Docker file that I built to include the Docker client inside. It is included in the examples repository that I've mentioned before with instructions on how to build it and use it. So this way I can spin up my spin up my Jenkins master as a Docker and also run Docker commands and using the host's Docker, which in this case is Vagrant. Okay, so we're done. And the WAR file that was built is accessible for me from the main job page. Another example that I'd like to show you before we move on to BlueOcean. How long do we have? Okay. In this case, I'm going back to the declarative example. And I'm actually doing some sort of a hack, which is not really a hack, it's a feature, where on the master itself, I'm telling Jenkins master, look, I'd like you to run this stage on a Docker agent, which is actually running under master, but this is the actual image that I want to use for running the tasks. So here I specifically tell it that I'd like to use the master to run my Docker build, or my Docker container build, and I tell it which image I'd like to use, and run the steps that are listed here, and move on to the next. So I have an Alpine build, I have a Debian build. Sorry? Yes, it's the master. It's doing a Docker run. I think in the output, yes. In the output, you can see the command that was actually executed by the Jenkins master. And you can see the output for the etc OS release. In our case, this is Alpine. And the next one is Debian. Okay? Yes, can you wait for the microphone, because I can hardly hear.
One question about the Docker slave. I want to know how much time does it take if it's because as I understood it, it's down and you're uploading it. Is it correct?
If the image does not exist, then Jenkins Docker will pull the image that it needs. So what I do, by the way, in this case, for example, I pre-pulled the images so they'll be accessible, so the demo will run quickly. But once I run it, the image is there and it's accessible for all the subsequent runs.
It actually takes, I suppose, more time, and it.
Yes, it's going to need to pull your image. That's why you need a proxy in the middle, some local Docker registry like Artifactory.
Okay, thanks. And the other question about uploading the Docker via the master, the last one you showed now.
Okay.
So why doing it under the master, not via slave?
Technically, it can be also done under a different slave. The only reason I did it is because only my master knows how to run the Docker run command. Only my master has Docker installed in it. But I could have replaced this to any other slave which supports running Docker. So it can be a slave defined in Google Cloud that is a big Linux machine that can spin up Docker containers inside. That would work just as well.
Thanks.
All right. Yes, another question here.
I have a couple questions as well.
Sure.
First question about running a pipeline on multiple agents.
Okay.
So we saw that each agent have its own workspace, and if I want to reference from one agent to another agent, reference a file, for example, how can I do it?
Technically, these agents are completely isolated. You delegate work to them, they work. So you can, there are a couple of options you can work your way around, like mounting common file systems into these agents, either as part of setting them up or pre-configure it. Very easy to do with Docker. If you define the Docker image that you want, there's another attribute. You can add more attributes to the agent beforehand, like mounting a different file system that you'd like to be accessible from within. And that's a good option to share files between the different agents.
Okay, but there's no way like doing it inside the
good question.
Jenkins file.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
It might exist. I haven't seen this option. But
Okay.
again, there are so many plugins developed for such use cases. I found myself many times about to develop my own plugin, and looking deeper, I just found that someone already developed a plugin for my problem. So I wouldn't be surprised if you'll find a solution out there already as a plugin.
Okay, another short question about pre-build steps, something that might run before I even define my arguments when I run the job. Is there an option to do it in the pipeline or in?
To dynamically create your parameters?
Yeah, it can be as well, yeah. So, to run something that can affect my parameters choices before.
A good question. I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if the guys that developed the dynamic parameter plugin have some integration with the pipelines. If you're not familiar with the problem, many times you like one of the parameters to actually run some command before and then populate that parameter with values from that result, like go and select the number of the names of namespaces in a Kubernetes cluster installed somewhere in Azure.
Yeah, it can be done with Scriptler, for example, but
Right.
it's not. It's like more than generating a job, like calling a job that can do some stuff that it's more complicated than just scriptler call or scriptler script?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer to it, and I'll be more than happy to add it to my examples if someone can share their solution later on.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay. We have 10 more minutes, and I'd like to show you some BlueOcean before we finish. I've mentioned before the BlueOcean as being a major step forward in the Jenkins user interface and user experience. So once you've installed the BlueOcean plugin, you always have this open BlueOcean, and I'll go to the topmost list of my pipelines. So it looks like this. The interface is a bit different, but once you play around with it, you'll find your way and you'll actually feel comfortable. In many ways, it gives you a better visibility. For example, if I look into a job itself or the execution of it, now I don't just see the major 3 stages, I also see the parallel tasks that were executed within a stage. And I can also access their output. So if I select one of them, I can see the output on the bottom here. And it'll be very easy to pinpoint that log. If you remember, I was talking about the verbosity of the logs in the pipeline, which is somewhat annoying. The BlueOcean gives you that level of separation, which makes it very easy to find your problem. And if you have a failed step, you just go into it, you find the log, and it's very easy to access, very fast to access. Another thing I wanted to show you, is how I load a new pipeline. I can preload it from local Git or from GitHub. I'm going to use a local Git. In my case, I have a demo here. Okay. I've let the BlueOcean load it. It loaded the repository. It found all of its branches. If you remember, Moore talked about, and I'm talking about, the multi-branch pipeline. One of the greatest needs that we need, or we have, is to have a development team be able to have the whole CI process, the whole CI pipeline available and running on every single branch. So I'd like to run the same build, the same tests, and the same deployments per branch. And the pipeline multi-branch, the multi-branch pipeline job type allows you to do that. And using BlueOcean, it can either load a single pipeline or the whole pipeline per branch. And in our case, you can see that each branch is a bit different. So in this case, I have 4 stages, sorry. And in this branch, I have a bug fix with still the old 3 stages, and the master, which is still originated on 3 stages. Just a second. Every change on every one of these branches will immediately be picked up and executed by Jenkins. Okay? Jenkins multi-branch pipeline plugin is by default configured to listen on changes to your branches. So a developer working on the branch locally on their development station, committing and pushing that code to the branch itself will automatically trigger Jenkins. You don't have to do anything other than load up or pre-configure a multi-branch pipeline plugin. I encourage you all, if you have any work done with branches, look this up. It has, I think, a tremendous effect and influence the culture of a development team. When everything is very accessible and very easy to see, there is no more I don't have time, there is no more I don't have resources. Just push the code and watch it run. And I think this is one of the greatest features of the pipeline and the multi-branch pipeline. And when you put it in BlueOcean, it even looks nice. Yes, questions here. Just a second, microphone.
I wanted to ask if the multi-branch feature cares about the source control it uses. For instance, in the previous lecture, we saw that he works with GitHub, and he added another feature branch in Git. So can it work with the TFVC or TFS?
It is supposed to be able to work with every version control that is supported by Jenkins. Okay? The BlueOcean way of doing things, the way I showed you of importing, currently supports only Git, but there are plans to add support for more. But you can always work around the other way. Define it as a multi-branch pipeline plugin from the classic user interface, and then go back and see it inside BlueOcean. BlueOcean has a lot of open issues that it still needs to resolve, but it is rapidly picking up with all of its gaps, and I do encourage you to look it up. More questions? Adi? Just a second, wait for the mic. We have our final 3 minutes, so I'm going to be...
What is the recommended approach to keep the pipeline scripts? Where would you recommend to put them?
The pipeline scripts are Jenkins files within your repository. Put everything in it, as much as you can. Assume always you have to make it work on a clean Jenkins 2 with a pipeline plugin. That's it. If you can spin up a Jenkins with just the pipeline plugin installed, and which is Jenkins 2 in this example, and pull the Jenkins files and get it to work, you're done, you're set. That's all you need to be able. That's your end goal.
So let's imagine the pipeline script itself is in the repository, and then my developer goes and commits a change to the pipeline script.
Right.
Will it immediately affect the workflow of the job?
Yes. That is why it should be done on a branch. And then test it in a multi-branch pipeline, and assuming it's okay, go through a pull request, code review, and merge. More questions? Yes.
Hi. Assume that I have a Git repository that already have a lot of branches, and I want to go to the multi-branch pipeline project. What happened to the old branches or existing branches that don't consist the Jenkins file inside?
Well, initially it will not be able to pick them up properly, but you need to do some preparation work. For example, just add the Jenkins file. You add it to your dev branch, and then have everyone either cherry pick or merge the changes from their dev to their feature branch.
Okay, so I need to assume that each one of the branches that I want to support must have a Jenkins file inside.
Yes.
Okay, and one more question. What happened when I'm doing merge between two branches? I need also to merge the Jenkins file as well?
Your infrastructure is part of your source. The infrastructure is no more a separate part. Infrastructure is part of your code, which requires every single developer to understand what the Jenkins file does, and if they don't let them touch the file.
Okay, so this will require a DevOps work to the Jenkins file update. Okay, but it's good, it's okay, I just asked. Perfect, thank you.
But just an example, in our case, many times developers see a need to do some sort of change to the pipeline, and they're not familiar with Jenkins file, so they'll come to someone else who does understand it. But it is the most important file in your repository, in my humble opinion. But yes, you don't break the Jenkins file. You never do.
Thank you.
We are at the end of our presentation. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop you here, but you're more than welcome to find me. I'll be here. At 4 o'clock, we're going to have the discussion groups. Please come and find us. Thank you very much.